One act of mercy changed the course of two nations, but what 70 Apache warriors did next defied every law of the Old West. If you're ready for a story that'll shake your soul, hit that subscribe button and let's ride into a tale where honor meant more than survival. The Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly under a merciless sun, its red rocks bearing witness to countless stories of survival and sacrifice. This was Apache country, where the line between friend and enemy shifted like desert sand in the wind. Among the scattered settlements and trading posts, tensions ran higher than a midnight fever, with every stranger potentially carrying either salvation or death in their saddlebags. Jake Morrison wasn't your typical drifter. This weathered cowboy had spent 15 years moving cattle across the most dangerous territories in the Old West, building a reputation as a man who kept his word and never backed down from what was right. His calloused hands told stories of honest work, while his steady gray eyes held the wisdom of someone who'd seen both the best and worst of frontier life. His horse, a sturdy buckskin mare named Esperanza, was his only companion and most prized possession. That fateful morning, as Jake rode toward the trading post of Dos Piedras, he discovered something that would test every principle he'd lived by. Lying beneath a cluster of mesquite trees, barely clinging to life, was a young Apache woman with a bullet wound in her shoulder and fever burning through her like wildfire. Her torn deerskin dress was stained with blood, and her dark eyes held a mixture of defiance and desperation that would haunt any decent man's conscience. What Jake didn't know was that this woman, Ayana, was the daughter of Chief Nailnish, a war leader whose 70 warriors had been searching for her for 3 days. In the unforgiving code of the Apache, her life was worth more than gold, and her death would mean war that would paint the desert red with blood from horizon to horizon. Jake's first instinct was to ride on. In Apache territory, getting involved with tribal matters was like stepping into a rattlesnake den blindfolded. The smart money said to keep moving, mind your own business, and live to see another sunrise. But as he watched Ayana struggle to lift her head, her lips cracked from thirst and her breathing shallow as autumn leaves, something deeper than survival kicked in. He dismounted slowly, hands visible, speaking in the few Apache words he knew. "It's no harm." Ayana's eyes tracked his every movement, ready to fight even in her weakened state. The bullet wound was infected, and without immediate care, she'd be dead before the next dawn. Jake had seen enough dying to recognize it when it stared back at him. The desert wind carried distant sounds, unshod hooves on rock, the kind of steady rhythm that meant mounted warriors were close. Very close. Jake's blood turned to ice water as he realized he was caught between saving a life and potentially signing his own death warrant. Every second he delayed meant the search party drew nearer. But looking into Ayana's eyes, Jake saw something that reminded him of his own sister, who died young from fever back in Missouri. Some choices define a man's character, and this was one of them. He made his decision with the quiet resolve that had carried him through 15 years of frontier hardships. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Jake knew time had run out. Whatever he was going to do, it had to be now. But what happened next would change everything he thought he knew about courage, honor, and the true meaning of the Old West. Without hesitation, Jake lifted Ayana in his arms, her body burning with fever against his chest. She weighed no more than a sack of grain, but her condition was worse than he'd initially thought. The infection had spread, and dark lines ran from the wound up her arm like poison rivers. She needed medicine, shelter, and skilled hands, none of which existed within 50 miles of this godforsaken stretch of desert. Esperanza stamped nervously as Jake approached, sensing danger in the air like animals do before a thunderstorm. The buckskin mare had been Jake's constant companion for 8 years, carrying him through blizzards, sandstorms, and more than one gunfight. She was his transportation, his security, and his ticket to survival in a land where a man afoot was a dead man walking. As the sound of Apache war ponies grew closer, Jake faced an impossible choice. He could put Ayana on Esperanza and send the horse toward the trading post, hoping someone there would help her. But that would leave him stranded in hostile territory with angry warriors closing in. Or he could mount up and ride hard, leaving the woman to die but saving his own skin. The thundering hooves were maybe 2 miles out now, close enough that Jake could feel the vibration through the soles of his boots. Ayana's breathing had become even more labored, and her dark eyes were starting to glaze over with the look of someone slipping away from life. Time was a luxury he no longer possessed. Jake made the kind of decision that separates heroes from survivors. He gently placed Ayana on Esperanza's back, securing her with his own rope and whispering words of comfort in her ear. Then he slapped the mare's flank and sent his most precious possession galloping toward town, carrying a dying Apache woman who might be his salvation or his doom. Standing alone in the desert dust, watching his lifeline disappear into the heat shimmer, Jake Morrison had just gambled everything on a single act of mercy. But what the approaching warriors would do when they found him would test every law of the frontier. The war party crested the ridge like a storm front, 70 Apache warriors mounted on paint horses, their faces streaked with war paint and their eyes burning with 3 days of desperate searching. Chief Nailnish rode at their head, a man whose very presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. His weathered face was carved from stone, but his eyes held the anguish of a father who might be too late to save his only daughter. Jake stood his ground as the thunder of unshod hooves surrounded him, dust clouds rising like smoke signals announcing his fate. The warriors formed a perfect circle, their rifles and lances pointed inward, creating a deadly arena with no escape. Their horses snorted and stamped, sensing the tension that crackled in the desert air like electricity before a lightning strike. Nailnish dismounted with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle, his moccasins silent on the rocky ground. He was tall for an Apache, with silver-streaked hair braided with eagle feathers and scars that told stories of countless battles. His English was perfect, learned from years of treaty negotiations that had taught him to speak the white man's language even as he fought the white man's wars. "Where is my daughter?" The chief's voice carried the authority of thunder rolling across canyon walls. "Her blood trail leads here, and here it ends. You will answer with truth, or you will answer with your life." The other warriors tightened their circle, and Jake could see death reflected in 70 pairs of dark eyes. Jake raised his hands slowly, palms outward in the universal gesture of peace. "I sent her to town. My horse carries her now. She was dying and I—" His voice trailed off as he saw something flicker across Nailnish's face, not anger, but something far more complex. The chief studied Jake's face with the intensity of a man reading tracks in fresh snow. The desert fell silent except for the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the nervous breathing of war horses. Every warrior waited for their chief's word, ready to paint the sand red with blood. But what happened next would shatter every expectation and reshape the very meaning of justice on the frontier. Nailnish walked slowly around Jake, studying him like a hunter evaluates dangerous prey. The other warriors remained motionless, their weapons ready but waiting for their leader's signal. In Apache culture, the decision of how to deal with this white man rested solely with the chief, and that decision would ripple through both their peoples like stones thrown into still water. "You gave your horse to save an Apache woman," Nailnish said, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been respect. "This is not the white man's way. White men take what they want and leave death in their footsteps." He stopped directly in front of Jake, close enough that Jake could see the pain and hope warring in the chief's weathered features. Jake met the chief's gaze without flinching. "It's this man's way. Your daughter was dying. I couldn't leave her to die any more than you could." The honesty in his voice cut through the tension like a knife through leather. Several of the younger warriors shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing something unexpected in this lone cowboy's words. The chief's eyes narrowed as he processed this response. In his 60 years, he had seen white men lie, cheat, steal, and murder. He had watched them break treaties like twigs and treat his people like wild animals to be hunted. But he had rarely encountered one who would sacrifice his own survival for an Apache life, especially not the life of a woman he'd never seen before. "If my daughter dies because of your choice," Nailnish said quietly, "you will beg for death before I grant it to you. But if she lives—" He paused, and Jake could see the internal struggle playing out across the chief's face. The desert wind carried distant sounds, a horse's whinny, shouting voices, the unmistakable commotion of arrival at the trading post. Smoke signals suddenly appeared on the horizon, rising in the coded patterns that had carried Apache messages across the desert for generations. The warriors watched intently as their chief read the ancient language written in gray smoke against the blue sky. What those signals said would determine whether Jake Morrison saw another sunset. The smoke signals spoke in the ancient language of the Apache, each puff and pattern carrying meaning as clear as spoken words to those who knew how to read them. Nailnish's weathered face remained stone still as he interpreted the message rising from the trading post, but Jake caught a subtle shift in the chief's posture, the kind of change a man learns to notice when his life depends on reading others. 3 short bursts of smoke, followed by a long column, then 2 quick puffs. The pattern repeated twice, and Jake watched as the tension around the circle of warriors began to shift like wind changing direction. Some lowered their weapons slightly, while others tightened their grips, uncertain what the message meant for the white man standing in their midst. "The medicine woman says my daughter breathes," Nailnish announced, his voice carrying across the desert's stillness. "The fever breaks, and the poison leaves her body." A murmur ran through the assembled warriors, relief mixing with continued suspicion. They had found their chief's daughter alive, but the question of what to do with her rescuer remained unanswered. Jake felt his knees nearly buckle with relief, but he forced himself to remain standing tall. In Apache territory, showing weakness could be interpreted as either fear or deception, both of which could prove fatal. The chief continued to study him with those penetrating dark eyes, as if trying to see into his very soul to understand what motivated this unprecedented act. But the smoke signals weren't finished. Another pattern began rising from the trading post, more complex this time, carrying additional information that made several of the older warriors exchange meaningful glances. Whatever this second message contained, it was shifting the entire dynamic of the confrontation in ways Jake couldn't begin to understand. The desert held its breath as Nailnish read the final smoke signal, his expression revealing nothing. When the last wisp of gray smoke dissipated into the azure sky, the chief's decision would determine not just Jake's fate, but potentially the relationship between two peoples who had been enemies for as long as anyone could remember. "The smoke carries more than news of my daughter's healing," Nailnish said, his voice taking on the formal tone reserved for matters of tribal law. "It speaks of how she was found, tied to your horse with your rope, covered with your blanket, a full water skin at her side and your own medicine pouch tucked into her hands." The chief's eyes never left Jake's face as he recited these details, each one carrying weight in the complex system of Apache justice. The gathered warriors began to murmur among themselves in their native tongue, and Jake caught enough words to understand they were discussing something unprecedented. In their culture, such an act of sacrifice by an enemy demanded a response equal to its magnitude. The question was whether that response would be blood or something far more valuable. One of the older warriors, his face marked with the scars of many battles, rode forward and spoke rapidly to Nailnish in Apache. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the man's gestures toward him seemed to be making some kind of argument. Other voices joined the discussion, some heated, others measured and thoughtful. "Yellow Crow says you should die for touching an Apache woman without permission," Nailnish translated, nodding toward the scarred warrior. "But Wise Snake argues that you honored her as you would honor your own sister, and that such honor demands honor in return." The chief paused, letting these words settle like dust after a windstorm. Jake had heard stories of the Apache Code of Honor, a complex system that governed everything from warfare to hospitality, debt, and retribution. He knew that once invoked, this code was as binding as iron chains and as unbreakable as mountain stone. Whatever decision emerged from this desert council would be final and absolute. The debate among the warriors grew more intense, with gestures and voices rising as men who had fought together for decades argued over the fate of one lone cowboy. But as Jake watched Chief Nailnish, he realized the final decision had already been made. The question was whether he would live to discover what it was. The argument among the warriors continued as the desert sun climbed higher, but Jake noticed that Nailnish had grown quiet, his gaze distant as if looking beyond the horizon to something only he could see. The chief's weathered hands rested on the handle of his war axe, but his grip was loose, thoughtful rather than threatening. Something deeper than tribal law was working its way through the old warrior's mind. I have led my people for 30 winters, Nailnish finally spoke, his voice cutting through the debate like a blade through silk. I have seen white men promise peace with one mouth while loading guns with the other. I have watched them treat our women like chattel and our children like wild animals to be caged. His words carried the weight of decades of betrayal and broken treaties. The warriors fell silent, recognizing the tone that preceded their chief's most important decisions. Jake stood motionless, aware that his life hung in the balance of this one man's judgment, but also sensing that something larger was at stake, perhaps the relationship between their two peoples for generations to come. But this white man, Nailnish continued, his eyes returning to Jake's face, gave away his only means of survival to save the life of an Apache woman he had never seen before. He asked nothing in return, expected no reward, sought no advantage. The chief paused, and Jake could see the internal struggle playing out behind those dark eyes. As a warrior, I should kill him for touching my daughter. As a chief, I should punish him for entering our lands without permission. But as a father, Nailnish's voice softened almost imperceptibly, revealing the man behind the legend. As a father, I owe him a debt that can never be fully repaid. The silence that followed was deeper than the desert's midnight stillness. Every warrior waited to hear how their respected leader would balance the competing demands of duty, honor, and gratitude. What happened next would either make Jake Morrison the luckiest man alive, or mark him as the recipient of an honor that would change his life forever. Chief Nailnish stepped back and raised his hand, the universal Apache signal for a formal pronouncement. The circle of warriors straightened in their saddles, recognizing that their leader was about to invoke tribal law in a way that would bind them all to whatever followed. Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Hear me, warriors of the Chiricahua, Nailnish's voice carried the authority of generations of leaders. This white man has shown honor greater than many who call themselves Apache. By our ancient law, such honor must be answered with honor. He gestured toward Jake, and every eye in the circle followed the movement. I declare him brother to our tribe. The words hit the assembled warriors like lightning striking dry timber. Several warriors sat back in shock, others began talking rapidly in their native tongue, and a few younger men looked as if they might challenge their chief's decision right then and there. In the entire history of the Chiricahua Apache, no white man had ever been granted such status. But brotherhood demands more than words, Nailnish continued, his voice rising above the murmur of shocked voices. It requires proof that the bond is true and lasting. Therefore, I offer this white man a choice that will show his heart to all our people. The chief's eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that seemed to burn right through him. Jake swallowed hard, knowing that whatever choice he was about to be offered would change his life forever. In Apache culture, there was no middle ground. You were either family or enemy, and the transition from one to the other came with responsibilities that lasted until death and beyond. You may walk away now, white man, Nailnish said, his voice carrying across the desert like thunder before a storm. Take a horse from our herd, ride to your people, and tell them of Apache honor. Or... He paused, and the silence stretched like a bowstring about to snap. You may prove your brotherhood in a way that will bind our peoples together for all time. The test of brotherhood requires more than good intentions, Nailnish announced, his voice taking on the ceremonial tone reserved for the most sacred Apache rituals. It demands that you prove your commitment to our people by facing the same dangers our warriors face, by showing courage under fire, and by demonstrating that your heart truly beats with Apache blood. Jake's mouth went dry as the chief continued. 3 days from now, a war party of Comanche raiders will pass through the Broken Arrow Canyon, driving stolen horses toward Mexico. They have killed Apache women and children, burned our sacred places, and shown no mercy to our people. The chief's eyes hardened like obsidian as he spoke of their traditional enemies. If you truly wish to be our brother, Nailnish said, stepping closer to Jake, you will ride with my warriors against these Comanche. You will fight beside us, bleed beside us, and prove that your loyalty to Apache ways is stronger than your fear of death. The other warriors nodded approvingly. This was a test they could understand and respect. Jake felt his world tilt on its axis. He had come to this desert as a simple cowboy driving cattle to market. Now he was being asked to join an Apache war party against their most feared enemies, to fight in a battle that had nothing to do with his own people's conflicts, and to risk his life to prove a loyalty he had never asked to claim. "But if you refuse," the chief continued, his voice carrying no judgment, "you may take a horse and ride away with our blessing. No Apache will harm you or yours, and the deed you did for my daughter will be remembered in our songs for generations." It was a fair offer, more than fair by frontier standards. The circle of warriors watched in absolute silence as Jake wrestled with the most important decision of his life. He could walk away now with honor and live to old age telling stories of his encounter with Chief Nailnish. Or he could ride into battle alongside 70 Apache warriors and face whatever destiny awaited in Broken Arrow Canyon. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush as Jake Morrison stood at the crossroads of two worlds, his decision carrying implications far beyond his own survival. He thought of his simple life driving cattle, the peaceful evenings by campfires, and the dream of someday owning a small ranch where he could live out his days in quiet contentment. All of that lay down one path. Down the other path waited Broken Arrow Canyon and a battle against Comanche raiders who had earned their fearsome reputation through decades of warfare across the southwestern territories. Jake had heard stories of Comanche fighting prowess, their skill with horses, their tactical brilliance, and their reputation for showing no quarter to enemies. Riding against them with Apache warriors would be like charging into the gates of hell itself. But as he looked into Chief Nailnish's eyes, Jake saw something that transcended the immediate danger. He saw a father's gratitude for his daughter's life, a leader's respect for unexpected honor, and a warrior's offer of true brotherhood in a world where such bonds were sacred and eternal. The chief wasn't asking him to die, he was offering him a chance to truly live. "Chief Nailnish," Jake said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his heart, "I've spent 15 years wandering this frontier, never belonging anywhere, never being more than a hired hand or a temporary neighbor." He paused, gathering courage for words that would reshape his destiny. "If your warriors will have me, I'll ride to Broken Arrow Canyon." A collective intake of breath ran through the assembled warriors, followed by a silence so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. Some faces showed respect, others skepticism, and a few revealed the kind of fierce approval reserved for acts of genuine courage. Chief Nailnish studied Jake's face for a long moment, as if confirming that the decision came from conviction rather than desperation. "Then it is done," the chief announced, his voice carrying the finality of mountain stone. "You will ride as my brother, fight as our brother, and if the spirits will it, you will return as our brother." The circle began to break up as warriors prepared to escort Jake back to their camp, but what awaited him in Broken Arrow Canyon would test every assumption about courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of brotherhood. 3 days later, Broken Arrow Canyon stretched before them like the mouth of a sleeping giant, its red rock walls rising 300 feet into a sky that seemed impossibly blue against the sandstone cliffs. Jake rode beside Chief Nailnish, mounted on a paint stallion gifted by the tribe, his Winchester rifle cleaned and loaded, his heart steady with the calm that comes only to men who have made peace with their mortality. The Comanche war party was exactly where Apache scouts had predicted, 40 riders driving a herd of stolen horses through the narrow canyon, confident in their reputation and careless in their security. What they didn't know was that 70 Apache warriors had spent the night positioning themselves along the canyon walls, turning the natural corridor into a deadly trap that would be sprung when the raiders reached the narrow passage known as the Devil's Throat. As the first Comanche riders entered the killing ground, Jake felt time slow to a crawl. He could see the war paint on their faces, hear the sound of unshod hooves on stone, smell the dust and sweat of hard-driven horses. Beside him, Chief Nailnish sat motionless as carved granite, waiting for the perfect moment when the entire raiding party would be committed to the canyon with no chance of retreat. The signal came as an eagle's cry echoing off the canyon walls, not from a bird, but from Apache lungs trained in the art of deception. What followed was 3 minutes of controlled chaos as warriors poured down from the rocks like a human avalanche, their war cries mixing with the screams of surprised horses and the crack of rifle fire bouncing between stone walls. Jake found himself in the middle of the fiercest fighting he had ever experienced, his Winchester barking repeatedly as he tried to stay close to Nailnish while the battle swirled around them like a deadly cyclone. A Comanche warrior on a black horse charged directly at him, lance lowered for a killing thrust, and Jake had perhaps 2 seconds to prove whether his courage was real or merely desperate bravado. The moment of truth had arrived in Broken Arrow Canyon, where the difference between brotherhood and death would be measured in heartbeats and gunpowder. When the gun smoke finally cleared and the echoes of battle faded into the canyon walls, Jake Morrison found himself still alive, still breathing, and forever changed by what he had witnessed and done. The Comanche raid had been broken completely, their stolen horses recovered, their war chief dead, and their surviving warriors scattered to the winds with a story of Apache vengeance that would keep them away from Chiricahua territory for years to come. Chief Nailnish approached Jake as he sat on a boulder, cleaning blood from a minor wound on his arm where a Comanche arrow had grazed him. The chief's face showed no emotion, but his eyes held something that hadn't been there before, the look reserved for men who had proven themselves in the crucible of combat. "You fought like Apache," was all he said, but coming from Nailnish, those 4 words carried more weight than any medal or commendation from the white world. The return journey to the Apache camp was a triumphant procession, with warriors singing ancient victory songs and Jake riding among them as a true brother, no longer an outsider looking in but part of something larger and more meaningful than anything